Are you ever playing video games and see a really cool item and go, I want to make that?
Well, me too, and today I'm going to show you how to make the Old School Runescape Dragon Scimitar. So let's get into it.
These are all the items you're going to need to complete this build, and I have them linked down below. You can also make this on an FDM printer, it's just going to require a lot more sanding. Okay, so here we have the file broken up into 5 pieces. We got 4 for the blade, and then 2 for the guard and the handle. I have it to where you can basically start from the handle and go all the way up to about the 3rd piece of the blade, and that's going to be where the wooden dowel runs into. Now, because of the way that this Dragon Scimitar bends, you can't fit the top piece, so I gave it a little nub right here with a connector so you can connect it in there. I also have, we can switch over to this. I also have just the blade in full if you need to slice it yourself, and if you, whether you have a bigger printer or a smaller printer, you can go in and hand slice everything yourself. So let's go and take it over to the resin printer and we'll get started. So we're going to start off by printing the bottom 2 pieces of the blade. And it's nice because you can print 2 at the same time without having any time cost difference because of the way that resin printing works. So it took about 15 hours to complete and it's looking really good. Now I need to take the prints off of the build plate and clean all the resin from the inside of the prints. So now that I got them off the build plate, I'm going to set it in the jacuzzi for about 5 minutes, and it's just going to spin it around and get a lot of that excess resin out of the area. It's going to take a little nice bath in the Polynesian spa.
The Polynesian spa.
I usually let these dry for about 30 minutes to an hour and shake them every once in a while, and then I put them in the UV curing station to cure. And while those are curing, we're going to start with the top 2 pieces of the blade now. And I think these came out great. Now it's time to get them off the build plate and get them in their little spa session. Alright, now that they're done with their little spa session, we're going to take them out and drain them, and then we're going to dry them off on a towel. Probably let them sit for 30 minutes to an hour, and then shaking them occasionally every 10 to 15 minutes just to make sure you want to get all the water out of these, because it'll damage the piece from the inside if you don't. Okay, so we're going to put the tip of the scimitar and the hyperbolic UV time chamber.
Hyperbolic time chamber. What the f is that?
To cure, and while we're doing that, we're going to have to do the 3rd piece regularly through a UV light. If you don't have the UV lamps, you can also just take them outside in sunlight. Just be really careful because the sunlight cures it really fast and it can warp it if you're not too careful and you leave it out there for too long. So just be time sensitive about that. Depending on where you are, I'd say probably no more than 5 minutes, maybe 10, but yeah, not too much more than that. So I didn't film the handle and the guard printing because it's pretty much just rinse and repeat from exactly what I did with all the blade pieces. So in order to make this blade look as seamless as possible, we're going to use 5-minute Gorilla Epoxy to really make sure that each piece bonds with each other, and then we're going to take the UV resin and fill it into these crevices. And that's why I like using the UV craft resin, because it's night and day how seamless it makes the blade look. So we're starting with the bottom 2 pieces of the blade, and from the way that I printed it with the supports, it made it a little bit wavy where the bottom 2 pieces connect, which is okay. A lot of the UV resin's gonna help that, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sand it down to where it lines up a little bit more flesh for the Gorilla Glue epoxy to really take hold of it. So I'm starting off with 80 grit on an orbital sander, and if you don't have an orbital sander, that's okay. You can totally do this by just hand sanding it. The orbital sander just makes it a little bit faster. And if you're using a hand sander, orbital sander, whatever it is, try to make sure to keep it as straight as possible. You really don't want to make those edges curve up. In my experience, it just gives it more of a headache to make it look seamless. So now that we have the base smooth, we can take the 5-minute Gorilla Glue epoxy and glue them together. So for this, it's a 2-in-1. You have to stir it. Try to make sure that it comes out as even as possible, and then make sure to stir it. I usually stir it for 30 seconds to a minute just to make sure it gets a really good, you want to make sure that it bonds really well. So this wooden dowel is 7/16 in diameter, and I cut it to about 18 inches in length from top to bottom, and that should fill all the way from the handle to about the 3rd piece of the blade. So when you're gluing, you really want to make sure you're getting all the little corners. I'm trying really hard not to make sure to get that center dowel piece with glue, because I typically like to throw the dowel in there to make sure that it holds properly and seals properly. And if you get glue into the piece where the dowel goes, the dowel has a potential of like hardening and sticking in there to where you can't move it. Okay, so now that I have it glued with the 5-minute Gorilla Epoxy, I'm going to put some UV resin and kind of just work it into the crevices. Now I do this pretty quickly after I glue it, just so it has a really nice bond with the UV resin and with the glue. But you can wait if you want to wait. I just don't want it to be misaligned or moved, because it does take about 5 to 10 minutes for the Gorilla Epoxy to do its work. Now, again, you don't need the UV lamps. You can go take it out in the sun for it to cure, but I don't know, the UV lamps for me just make it a little bit faster, make it a little bit easier than taking it outside, moving it back in. So that step is up to you, whether you want to have them or not. And if you are interested in grabbing any of the floodlights or any of the other tools that I use, I have all my links down below. Another thing I want to add is when you're adding this UV resin to the piece, make sure to not overdo it. If you have like large drips or like large areas of just pooling resin, it's just going to make it that much harder for you to sand it once you have to go back through and sand each piece. So that's why I like to do the sponge brushes, just kind of spreading it out evenly and making sure it's everywhere. You're going to have a little bit of residue on the sides. You can see it here. But the thinner it is, the better. It's honestly better to layer it up, kind of building it up as it goes along. And then we're essentially going to rinse and repeat the exact same steps as we did for the bottom 2 pieces for the top 2 pieces. So here you can see I'm filling in this hole with a little piece of just paper towel and dipping it in with resin. The reason why I create those holes is just so when it's printing, the resin can kind of seep out of it and it's not as wasteful. You're not getting resin trapped inside of the pieces. So now that we have the top and the bottom pieces put together, we're going to put the sword together completely. And the thing I really like about this project is that there is a lot of steps, but it's mostly just rinse and repeating the same steps over and over again. So it's not really that complex of a build. And if you don't have any time restraints, you're not on doing a con crunch or anything like that, I really recommend letting the 5-minute Gorilla Epoxy, even though it says 5 minutes, giving it at least 24 hours to really bond. The craft resin should cure pretty quickly, pretty instantly, but I don't know, before you start hammering on it with some sandpaper, I always like to give it a little bit more time to really seal and cure. So I actually had to shave down the sides a little bit on the handle, because when I was putting it into the guard, it actually cracked just a little bit. The handle is a little too precise. It shouldn't be a problem. I'll put some UV resin on it, and that's one of the great things about the UV resin is if anything chips or cracks, you can always just put a little bit on there, cure it, and it's brand new when you sand it down. So you guys won't also have to worry about the handle. I'm going to go back through and resize it to where it fits in a little less snug. So this shouldn't be an issue when you download the file. Okay, so now that the blade is all put together, we're going to start sanding this. So I started with 220, and when you start sanding it, you really want to make sure to follow the lines. This is a low poly scimitar, and you're going to end up losing a lot of those hard edge lines if you're not careful. So definitely don't do an up and down motion. You see here, I'm trying to fit within each triangle and keep those lines preserved. Now, I break out a orbital sander here. If you're going to use an orbital or a hand sander, just really be careful not to go over any lines. It'll ruin that low poly effect that you're trying to achieve with the Dragon Scimitar. Okay, so now that we have the first wave of sanding done, what we're going to do is take some of that UV craft resin and go over some of these lines where we've merged them together again. We're going to go over it pretty lightly. You don't have to do it as heavy as the first time around. We're just trying to fill in some of the little cracks and crevices that either got swept away from sanding it or they just didn't bond really well the first time. And then once we have the UV craft resin applied, we're going to hit it with some 220 grit sandpaper to sand it back down and make it seamless. Okay, so now that the guard and the handle are put together, we're going to fill in some of these resin drain holes and fix the area where the guard got chipped when we put the handle on it. So here I'm using a metal file, but just be careful if you are going to use them because they can leave some pretty deep scratches in your resin prints because obviously the metal file is way stronger than the resin print is. So you see me kind of going back between the 220 and the metal file. Just be careful with how much pressure you put on these prints. So now that we have everything sanded down, I ended up putting the blade and the guard together just so it's a little bit easier to spray, but we're going to separate them later on so it's easier to paint. But I am spraying this with 2-in-1 sandable filler primer, and essentially what that does is when you spray it down, it kind of covers some of those surface level scratches left by the sandpaper. And after a few layers of this, it should be smooth enough for us to be ready to paint. And after a few hours of letting the filler primer dry and really bond with the print, I'll come back through and hit it with some 320 grit sandpaper to really make it nice and smooth. And then once again, we'll take it back into the paint booth to hit it with some more filler primer. And then once the filler primer dries, we're going to hit it with some apple red Rust-Oleum spray paint. And for the first wave of painting it, you just kind of want to get the paint on there and just having it bond with the piece. We're going to sand it down with some 400 grit sandpaper to make it extra smooth. And you don't want to waste the paint that you have by completely covering the piece. While the blade is drying, I'm going to hit the handle and the guard with some 320 grit sandpaper to really smooth it out and prep it to be painted. When I started painting the handle, I ended up using the Coastal Gray spray paint, but as you can see here, it doesn't really change the piece all that much. It kind of still looks like it has the filler primer on it. And the Dragon Scimitar in the game definitely has a darker handle. So what I ended up going with was a Rust-Oleum gloss dark gray spray paint, and that did the trick. It made it just the color I needed it to be. Okay, so now that the first layer is dry, we're going to hit it with some 400 grit sandpaper. Now, I'm going to stop at this process of sanding. Some people like to go even higher. I've seen some people use all the way up to 3,000. I think that's personally overkill for this project specifically. Now, if you're going with lots of golds or metallic kind of items, those higher level of grit sandpapers are definitely needed, but for this project I think 400 it's smooth enough, it looks great, and you don't really need to go higher on that unless you just really want to. Now that we got it all sanded down and it's smooth, we'll spray it 1 to 2 more times, typically 3 times to get the full coverage, but it'll depend on how heavy you apply your paints. Then for the final step, what we're going to use is some matte clear enamel to really protect the piece and give it that nice matte finish. You can also use a satin or a gloss finish. It's just my personal preference that I think RuneScape items in particular look really nice with a matte finish. And then we're just going to repeat the process for the guard and the handle with the matte finish. And just like the painting process, I'll go over this 2 to 3 times to really get a nice seal going. So now we come to the final step, which is just gluing the piece in. We'll attach the rod. Typically I like to put a little bit of glue on the rod and then inside the base of the guard and the blade. It allows for a really nice seal. So when I'm letting mine dry, I typically like to put mine upside down, just letting gravity kind of do the work. Just be careful with the tip. You can put some foam or a blanket down just so it doesn't break. And now that it's completely dry, let's take it outside and run it through a few test swings to see how it holds up.